Good morning and welcome to our Zoom with the HR MacMillan Space Centre. We're going to be today learning about living in space and all the things that go along with that. So Trish and Michael, you can take it away.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. I have my friend Michael here from the Space Center again today, and we're going to talk about some really cool stuff. We're going to talk about working in space. So we did a fun conversation not too long ago where we chatted about eating in space and go to space. They have a lot of other things that they need on as well. Experiments to do. Sometimes they have repairs on the space station they need to do. Sometimes they need to go on the outside of the International Space Station and do some work. And in fact, if you've ever heard about the robotic arm in space called the Canada arm, have you ever heard of that? Oh, Michael has. Well, the Canada arm isn't really like this, but it does do a similar job to what this big arm does. Woody, all right. Come out of the picture, Woody. So it does do a similar job in that it helps the astronauts do its work. So Michael, I'm going to hand it off to you and you're going to chat a little bit about living in space with us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Trish. Yeah, living in space is a really fun topic to think about. And it's one of those things where sometimes it's just like the basics. And Rachel and Trish covered some of the basics, you know, eating, sleeping, going to the washroom. And all of that is part of the experience of being on the International Space Station, because the main mission, you're thinking, why are we sending humans up into space? Well, it's to figure out what happens to our human bodies up there. Basically, all of the astronauts are the experiments themselves. So quite often what they're doing is that they're bringing up experiments, they're testing things on their bodies, what's happening to our eyes, what's happening to our blood, because as we saw last week, I showed you some examples of being in a low gravity environment. Weird things happen with your body. So what I'm going to show you is some very important things that the astronauts have to do. And of course, if you have any curiosities, any questions that are coming up, please just raise your hand, and we'll get to some of those. And what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you some really cool videos of actual astronauts in space. So here is Chris Hadfield, and he is a Canadian astronaut. And he's getting out some gear here because he's about to do one of the most important tasks that astronauts have to do, and that's to exercise. And you're like, why do you have to go exercise up into space? Well, the thing is, right now, remember last week we were talking about gravity pushing down on us. Right now, even though you're sitting in your chair, you might not think that your muscles are doing very much, but they are. They're keeping you upright. They're keeping you seated. And all those muscles are working, even when you're sitting here on Earth. But in space, because of the low gravity environment, your muscles aren't working. So it's very, very important that they do those exercises every day. And you can also maybe see on some of these that they're monitoring their body, they're monitoring their heart rates, and the people that are down on Earth, they're monitoring their signals as well, monitoring how their body changes.
So I just wanted to share with my friends about experiments in space. And one of my favorite experiments is they actually took fish to space in an aquarium because they wanted to see how fish swam around. Now the aquarium had to be a special aquarium because they certainly couldn't let the water float out of the aquarium. So it was a special one that kept all the water together, and then the fish went up and could actually swim in space.
And so here is an experiment. On what happens to the human body as we're in space. As you can see here, they can just float around in space. And what they're doing is experiments on how the blood flows through their bodies. As we're here on Earth, if we flipped ourselves upside down, if we did a headstand, all of the blood would rush into our head, and we'd probably get a really red face. And you could, it may have happened to you at one time or other. But in space, you can see that they can flip around and they can be upside down. There is no up or down or left or right in space. It's all the same. So all of the blood sort of like evens out around their bodies. And so that's really important, because when you're up there for a really long time, you can imagine that the inside of your body will probably change over time. Two brothers, they were identical twins. And one of the twins went up into space while the other twin was down here on Earth. And they did the exact same things. And they ate the same things, and they did some of the same experiments, and they monitored what changed between those identical twins, because basically the insides of their bodies, they're exactly the same because they're twins. But what happened when the twin from space came down to Earth, they realized he was a little bit taller. Isn't that a bit weird? All of a sudden, that gravity just sort of like elongated him out, and he was a little bit taller, and he was actually also a little bit younger as well, if you can believe. Like, his cells inside of his body didn't age as much. But as soon as he got back down to Earth, and all of a sudden the gravity pushed down on him again, he wasn't as tall anymore. He was exactly the same height as his brother, and all of the insides of his body sort of like went back to normal as well. The other really important thing about gravity in space is what happens to our eyes, because our eyes are very sensitive, and there's a lot of fluid in there. And when the gravity sort of like flushes out when you're up there in space, sometimes it'll pool around the eyes. And a lot of astronauts, when they come back down to space, they don't have perfect vision anymore. They have to get corrective lenses. Almost all astronauts have to get glasses when they come back down to Earth. So studying what happens to our eyes for long duration space flights, say if we want to go to Mars, Mars is going to be like almost like 2 years in space. And as of now, we haven't sent anyone for that long. Now, I want to show you, I'm going to end with one more really cool thing, because yesterday, talking about rockets up into space, there was going to be a launch of a brand new rocket. And I highly encourage you and your parents, because that launch was actually delayed until Saturday. So you should definitely go and check out. It's going to be around noon on Saturday, the SpaceX Crew launch, a brand new rocket that's going to be launching, and we can send you the link to NASA to watch it. But just to give you a little preview, I'm going to find a little launch here so you can kind of see what I'm talking about.
3, 2, 1. And we have ignition.
Liftoff confirmed. Antares and the SS Gene Cernan now bound for the International Space Station.
Wasn't that cool? So yeah, definitely check that out. On Saturday around noon is when that new SpaceX rocket is going to launch on Saturday.
Awesome. So give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. You guys hear me? Good. All right, so Lexi has a question to start with. Lexi, what's your question?
How long can people safely live in space?
That's a really good question, Lexi.
Good question. Yeah, so we are experimenting with that because every once in a while we try to figure out if we can send up astronauts for just a little bit longer. And at the moment, the longest that an astronaut has ever been up there, I think, is for almost just over a year. And that wasn't planned, actually. That was a Russian astronaut that was supposed to be picked up by a rocket, but the rocket didn't work. And so he was up there for a little bit longer than intended. So about a year is as long as we've had so far. But there are been astronauts that have been up for 2 times. And so that's in total, they've been up in space for longer than that, but for one duration for just over a year. So we certainly haven't gotten close to the kinds of environments it might be like to get to Mars. Mars is going to be at least a 2-year mission there and back, probably longer.
Hey, Michael, since you showed our really great rocket video, I thought it would be neat to share the name of the new rocket with everybody because it does have a special name.
The Dragon?
Yeah.
Yeah, the SpaceX Dragon. It's a really cool rocket. It's a brand new rocket. The previous one was called the Space Shuttle, and that was the main way for all of the NASA astronauts to get up into space for about my entire lifetime. Actually, it first started in 1980, and then it stopped in 2011. So this is really exciting. This is the first brand new rocket that I've been able to ever experience, and that's going to launch on Saturday. I'm super excited.
And when I looked at the videos yesterday, Michael, what I really liked too was the astronauts were wearing brand new spacesuits. So they looked very different from the spacesuits that the astronauts that we grew up watching the space shuttle with. Their spacesuits yesterday were very much a smaller suit that fit them very well, and it looked like they could move around a lot. And what I liked about their gloves especially was they had special fingertips that everything would work on a touch screen inside their new rocket. So it was like they had iPads everywhere inside the rocket.
Miss Isla, what is your question?
I have a question, but I just wanted to say that my mom and dad once tried to become a rocket, tried to become an astronaut, but he didn't get to do it, so he almost became an astronaut.
Yeah, it's a tough go, and I mean, like, if for me, I don't know if I'd be able to get through some of the training exercises. There is a lot of training that you have to do, and a lot of rigorous testing that has to go on, not just with your body, but with your mind as well. There's a lot of mental challenges that go into place. And you know what? We're going to actually have a talk with an actual astronaut in July, I believe. July? Yeah, I think it's July. Yeah. So if you guys are still around, we're going to send you. We're going to have a live chat with the. He hasn't been up to space yet, but he's been chosen. His name's Joshua Kutrick, and he's going to be an astronaut. One of the next Canadian astronauts to go up into space. So we could ask questions about how he became an astronaut candidate. Great questions.
So Henry wrote in the chat box, where is the SpaceX Dragon going?
Oh yeah, great question. So the only place that humans are going to right now in space is the International Space Station. That's where all of the videos that you just saw, that's where the astronauts work, that's where they live. But soon, we're going to go to the moon, and the moon is going to be the next destination. So this particular rocket that you're going to watch on Saturday, that is actually just a servicing. So the two astronauts, they're actually not going to go into the space station. It's just a test. They're going to go to the space station. They're going to wave, hey guys. They're going to drop off some supplies, and then they're going to come back. So if you keep watching, you'll be able to see how they re-enter into the atmosphere. And there's a little capsule. It's sort of like a triangle like this. And when it enters back down into the atmosphere, and a parachute pops open, and then it floats down into the ocean, and then a boat has to come in and pick them up in the middle of the ocean. So that whole thing probably takes, I think it takes about a couple hours. So if you keep watching, you'll be able to see them pick them up in the ocean as well.
That's really cool. So Lacey, what's your question, kiddo?
How many astronauts are going up?
So on the spaceship, there's going to be two astronauts. Their names are Bob and Doug. And they are usually in a rocket, there's usually only about 2 or 3. In the Apollo missions back in the days when we went to the moon, there was 3. But normally in modern times, there's usually 2 astronauts that go up at a time.
So Stella, do you still have a question? Yeah. What's your question?
Why was the flight of the launch of the rocket ship delayed?
Oh, so you were watching. Great. So it was delayed because of weather. And, you know, when you're preparing for something, there's so many things so many variables that you have to think about. And one of them is weather. And that's essentially why it got delayed. Because if you think about it, you know, if there's storms up there, they could cause some problems for the rocket going up. But the really interesting thing that I actually learned yesterday, because when I'm watching these things, I'm still learning, is that when they make the decision to not launch because of weather, it's not always just because of the launch, but they also look at the weather that's going to happen in the ocean area where they're going to pick up the astronauts, because you don't want to have a big storm over the ocean when you're picking up those astronauts. So what they're looking at is they're making this decision for like almost like a 4-hour window. What's the weather going to be like for that period of time in that area? And you may also wonder where they launch from, and all of the rockets that send up humans since the Apollo days have been in Florida. And the really interesting thing, they chose Florida for a very specific reason. One, kind of like go this trajectory where it kind of goes like this, where it's rocketing over the ocean. That also means that the rocket is not going to drop any debris over people that are on the ground, less chance of that. And it's also close to the equator as well. That's where there's more gravity. The closer you are to the equator, the easier it is to get up there. So that's one of the reasons they chose Florida as the place to launch all of the rockets.
That's a really good observation, Michael. I learned that too yesterday when I was watching the rocket launch, that the ocean weather is really important, because you certainly don't want to pick up the astronauts when it's a really bumpy ocean.
So, Michael, you just said that they launch near the equator because there's more gravity there? There's more gravity near the equator?
Yeah, well, here, let me pull out the...
Really something that I haven't actually thought of before. I just figured that on Earth, the gravity was the same everywhere. So I'd love to hear a little more about that. And then, really... Sasha, I see your question. Okay, I'll ask your question next, kiddo.
So the really interesting thing about our Earth is that it sort of looks like a round ball. But the thing is, it's not actually perfectly round. It's kind of a little bit squished. And so what that means is that there's more stuff here around the middle of the Earth. So even though the gravity is not that much more in the middle as opposed to up here, it's just enough to kind of like, once you get out into like the outer effects of like a rocket and looking for the trajectory that you want to go around the Earth, it's just enough to make it just a little bit easier. And what that means by easier, that means cheaper fuel, because rocket fuel is really expensive. So if it's easier, that means it's lighter to get up into this area. That means that they don't have to use as much fuel. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't launch rockets from other areas, like in Russia, where they launch a lot of rockets. You know, that's in the northern hemisphere. So it's still possible. It's just easier if you're closer to the equator.
Okay, Sasha, what is your question?
How much dust is under the rocket ship?
Ooh, there's a lot of dust under there. And, you know, one clean, those rockets really, really well, because there's a lot of stuff that can accumulate around them. But they're basically, it's a giant bomb. So there's a lot of stuff that they got to do to kind of like make sure to clean that outside, because they don't want any of that dust or stuff getting in there. But certainly after the rocket is launched, it's a big mess. But that's why they do it in a very remote area. Those places where they would launch those rockets, nobody lives around there. So and if you go to watch those rocket launches, you're way, way, way far back. You're not close at all.
And they often spray water underneath the rockets when they light the engines, right, Michael, to make sure that the fire doesn't go anywhere.
It's a very controlled explosion.
That's really neat. I wanted to share with you guys something. So when I was in grade 6, we read a book that made me super interested in space travel and Africa, actually. So this is actually still one of my favorite books. Trish and Michael, have you guys ever heard of this book? It's called Countdown by Ben Michelson.
No.
Okay, so it is a story. I recommend this to anyone. So it is a story about, I see there's glare, about a 14-year-old boy from the United States who is chosen as part of the junior astronaut program, and he's one of the first teenagers in space. And so he gets chosen, and while he's up there, part of his job is talking on the radio to kids around the world, and he starts talking to a Maasai warrior in Kenya. And so part of the book is about the differences between their two lives, but then it's also about space travel as well. So this is one of my favorite books to read. So I recommend it to anyone who's a little bit older or has an adult to read to you. But it's called Countdown by Ben Michelson. So
Perfect. I wrote that down. Thanks, Haley.
Yes. So on that note, Lexi had a question. Lexi, what was your question?
When was the last time there was a human on the moon?
Yeah, I'm writing that down too. It's been a long time since any humans have walked on the moon. 1972, which was born, ending the mission of the Apollo, the rockets going to the moon. They wanted to figure out what the next mission was going to be. And what they decided around 1972 is that they wanted to collaborate with the Russians. So back then they were sort of competing with them, but they're like, you know what, maybe we should combine our talents and work together. And by working together, they can achieve so much more. And so since then, they have been working together. And that's really what the International Space Station is all about. It's all about collaborating, and all of the countries combining all of their resources, all of their smart scientists to create this giant group project. It's probably the biggest group project that the world has ever created. And that's really what the main mission is. And hopefully that spirit will continue when we go to the moon and to Mars.
One of my favorite stories about collaboration, Michael, is that the country of Italy, which is a very small country and doesn't have a lot of astronauts or space technology, but they contributed a brand new coffee maker to the International Space Station, so all the astronauts could have fresh coffee in space. Now, I think that's a pretty important contribution.
Absolutely. Every country that every astronaut that comes up actually gets to bring up their a special food item that's very special to them. And of course, when Japanese astronauts went up, they made sushi when they got to the International Space Station. And some of the other astronauts appreciate that because a lot of the food that they eat up there is a lot of the same stuff.
All right. So we are running short on, well, not running short on, running out of time for today, but of course we'll be back here next Thursday. So if you guys have more questions, you can ask them next week. I wanted to thank you guys for coming and joining us. Boys and girls, can we please say thank you to Trish and Michael? Say thank you with a big old wave. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you all again